So let's get stuck into our first topic of the evening. Now, a lucky few of us went out to vote yesterday. What a treat it always is to exercise our democracy. The constituencies of Uxbridge and Ruislip, Selby and Ainsty and Somerton and Frome were up for grabs after a number of MPs quit in solidarity with Boris Johnson. So Labour turned around a 20,000 majority to win Selby. The Lib Dems got 55% of the vote in Frome, but the Tories hung on in Uxbridge due to what I think the visceral hatred of Sadiq Khan's ULEZ charges. So, my question to you is, should the Tories take stock, think about this result, think about what it shows, about what people want, and scrap their own anti-motorist, anti-car green agenda? So, what do we think? Let's start with you, Reem. What do you think? Now, you have been quite an active... you live in Uxbridge and Ruislip.
I do. I live in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and the Mirror actually came out with an article, well, two articles.
They did. I think we actually have it
to
show to our viewers. I don't know if it will appear at some point, but we do. Yes, go on.
So these two articles effectively about my views on the NHS, and they called me a top Tory, which I'm most certainly not, and they claimed that my views on the NHS would mean that Hillingdon Hospital, the hospital that I was born in actually, is actually going to be at risk as a result of the Conservatives winning that seat. Now, this is, of course, a completely ludicrous claim. First of all, I don't hold any position in the local Conservative Association.
Yet.
Well, maybe. I also am 20, and I just have started full-time in Westminster. I have no power to change national health policy. So I did find it slightly strange, but it does show how desperate they really were in order to try and claim back some of those votes. And
yeah, absolutely. I was just going to read. It says, yes, exclusive, Uxbridge by-election campaign in chaos. As Tory says NHS should be abolished. Reem Ibrahim has repeatedly attacked the health service, which she described as a mistake. So there you go. There was the attempt by the Mirror to, slander Reem.
Not just the Mirror, but Danny Beale also included it in his campaign video.
Well, there you go. Very interesting indeed. Paul, to my question that I'm posing this evening about how the result in Uxbridge, now the Conservatives are deeply unpopular at the moment among large swathes of the electorate for obvious reasons that we've spoken about many times. But this result in Uxbridge does show that ULEZ is a deeply unpopular policy. Does that also show that we're not willing to accept green policies if they cost us too much, and the Conservatives and Labour should rethink?
I think that's exactly what it shows, and I think there is a danger from, and I say this as somebody on the Labour side, that we trigger this, what some people have called this green lash, which is a real hostile reaction to the whole kind of race towards net zero, potentially the cliff edge scenario. And this is, by the way, an argument that's been used even by people in the trade union movement, the GMB union, Unite the Union, which represent people in the energy industry, who are worried about this, as I say, this race to net zero, and think that it could result in massive job losses and erosion of, stable industries where people are employed. Many thousands of their members are employed. And actually, just electorally, is really unpopular. I guess what I would say is, look, we're all in favour of a green environment, but if you're going to penalise motorists in this way, if you're going to try and force people out of their cars, then you've got to have a public transport system worthy of the name. And the reality is, at the moment, we don't. If you look at the railway system, for example, it's falling apart. Our railway system, since privatisation, is completely unreliable. No, it's absolutely true, and the evidence proves it.
That's absolutely not true.
It's
not privatisation.
It's absolutely true that privatisation, even under privatisation...
I'll let you come back after Paul's finished.
Even under privatisation, the private rail companies have been hugely subsidised by government and by the taxpayer, and actually the system is still unreliable, and it is still fragmented, and it is still dirty, and it is still expensive. So what we need to do, one of the things we need to do is renationalise the railways, invest properly in the railway system, Very popular policy.
And then we won't need cars.
Very
Is that your
policy.
point?
And if we invest properly and actually make it a proper effective service and a proper integrated system that people and a cheap system that people can use, then we may not need to force people into their cars, and we may not need to levy these sorts.
But the thing is, I don't think
to be a holistic approach.
I don't think people are being forced into their cars. I think they quite like driving them. I mean, it gives you the freedom to stop when you like, to change direction, change destination,
to sit in traffic for
carry.
3 hours.
Yeah, it's not great in city centres, of course it's not, and it's not great in the southeast in particular. I'm sure across most of the country there are many a traffic jam, but I do think there's something, you know, freeing about being able to get into your car. Reem, so there are lots of green policies that will cost people. So we've got gas boilers. New gas boilers. Should we have a ban on those? Currently, I believe there is one scheduled for 2025, which is very soon indeed. There's also the ban on new diesel and petrol cars being sold in the UK from 2030. Do you think this ULEZ result here, which is what it is in Uxbridge, shows that perhaps those kind of policies need to be rethought?
Oh, absolutely. And then at the moment we've got the Green Energy Levy, which effectively means that the government are increasing artificially the prices of energy bills and then also subsidising it with the energy price guarantee. I mean, some of these policies really do feel quite ludicrous indeed. When we're thinking about why environmental policies aren't actually popular with the sort of core green conservative vote, really it's as a result of the fact that these policies are making them poorer. ULEZ is a £12.50 effectively extra tax on your ability to drive your car in that zone. Uxbridge and South Ruislip was going to then be that area that was going to be expanded to. It's expanded to the rest of the M25. Of course, it's unpopular. We're not just thinking about, you know, the poor and the vulnerable, but actually those that are car-bound, those that are disabled, that have to drive to get to places.
And it's worth, of course, noting that Sadiq Khan would say that this is a necessary measure in order to cut back on pollution and to save lives and to stop the rates of asthma, for example, among children. That is his justification for this policy. Others, of course, have pointed out that it may well be a money-grabbing scheme, but I believe we have an image to show which shows us that this is not just a London issue, this ULEZ scheme. Across the country, there are various low-emission schemes. As you can see from everywhere, from Southampton to Aberdeen, we have some kind of scheme in order to which essentially charges drivers for polluting. So this is widespread across the United Kingdom. Now, of course, the Conservatives only managed to cling on to this constituency by the skin of their teeth. I think it was by about 500 votes. So it wasn't, you know, a roaring a win, but Labour were very much wanting to get this one. Do you think that this actually comes down to more than just ULEZ, or is this just the way they're going to have to, or is this just in this instance, if you know what I mean?
I think this result in Uxbridge was clearly about ULEZ, and I think the proof of that is that the Tory victor made that point himself in all of his kind of post-election, post-announcement interviews. He made it very clear that this was a kickback from the constituency against Sadiq Khan. The interesting thing about that, by the way, is I suspect that people in Conservative Central Office were not best pleased about that, because of course what they would have liked, I think, is for the Tory candidate Tuckwell to have come out and said, yes, this is an endorsement of Rishi Sunak. You know, this is clearly showing that the next election is far from done. Rishi is making inroads in terms of the recent inflation announcement, with inflation going down and the migration bill going through. And instead, all of his interviews were specifically about ULEZ. So that really
That's a very good point, Paul.
That was manna from heaven for Labour, because it allowed them to say, well, of course, you know, this is not representative of a national picture. This is about ULEZ. And you know what? The Tory candidate himself has said that. I think that was
it's a by-election, right? They of course, they're going to campaign on local issues. And I'm sorry, I think the CCH could be pretty happy about the fact that they won the seat in the first place.
Well, of course.
And then actually Steve, you know, ran a very effective campaign because he was actually able to then sort of talk about local issues that were important to residents. He was born in Hillingdon Hospital, for example.
But it doesn't reflect on Rishi Sunak. I think that was Paul's point. But it's quite interesting because the Labour deputy leader, Angela Rayner, who always has a lot to say, she even admitted that the ULEZ policy cost her party the by-election. She said there needs to be a rethink. And she said it is unaffordable for many Londoners and penalises them without more of a scrappage scheme. Reem, would you support this policy around the country if there were more scrappage schemes funded by the taxpayer?
I would absolutely support scrapping ULEZ. It wouldn't necessarily be funded by the taxpayer. What I want is actually these policies to be rolled back, Emily.
Well, there you go. And you? More scrappage schemes?
I don't like cars. I don't, we're a small island. I don't think we're an island that's actually made for huge numbers, millions of cars on our roads. I would much rather see a society where we had public transport as a viable, realistic, clean, safe and cheap alternative. But the truth is we don't have that alternative at the moment, and therefore I think to penalise people through using their cars when for many of them it's the only medium of transport that they've got is probably unfair. So I would be in favour of scrapping it, but then investing properly in public services, renationalise the railways, have a good public bus system
More
as well,
taxpayer
and
money
you get people
being spent.
out of their cars.
Ah, how
and get them
wonderful.
onto public
Well,
transport.
you know, the solution to all of your problems seems to be throwing more taxpayer money at every single problem in this country.
Let's look, Reem, at the privatisations that have taken place, by and large, which have been an unmitigated disaster. Let's look at water. What are the water companies doing, apart from running down the service, polluting our rivers, creating an enormous amount of defects and leaks, and actually making a huge amount of profit into the bargain?
You're absolutely right that Thames Water, for example, a government-created monopoly, has not actually acted effectively. They've done some terrible things, for example, with sort of polluting with sewage and that kind of thing. But actually, again, that was a government-created monopoly. If government were to stay out of water companies, were actually stay out of rails, for example, let's talk about transport, this is the point that you're trying to make here. The government still pick which private companies are actually getting those contracts for those legs. The government chose, for example, that Avanti West Coast would get the leg between London and Manchester. The reason why these companies aren't effective is because the basic principles of the market, competition and failure, do not happen. These companies can't fail because the government pick them.
Well, look, the truth is that there's probably no area, tell me if I'm wrong, there's probably no area of the economy or our public infrastructure that you would not privatise, true or false?
No area of the public sector. Of course there are. I mean, look at the military. Education, for example. I believe in Milton Friedman's educational vouchers.
So you know, the logic of the position of saying that we should have water privatised, which is, you know, an essential public good, and clearly the public is always going to need water. Society can't function without it. And similar with the railway system.
Similar with food, but we have privatised supermarkets.
The principles that you would apply to say, actually, privatisation there drives up efficiency, drives up productivity. What logic then says to you, well, actually, we shouldn't apply it to the military or to the police force? Why not? Why not have the police
I think
force sponsored by Shell or Enron?
Water is
like
one of those public goods, public services, whatever you want to call it. That is probably there is the strongest argument for it to be publicly owned. But energy, for example, which was what Jeremy Corbyn wanted to nationalise and Keir Starmer wanted to nationalise until very recently, thrives off competition. We need competition in our energy system, and I would argue a little more competition probably in our health service wouldn't go amiss.